of Transnational Institute, Netherlands, which focuses on the permanent state of war and the pacification of resistance. Niamh worked with the UN in areas of peace building and human rights. Our next speaker is Jan Oberg, who is Director of Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, Sweden. He has written much about Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi as extraordinary human beings who, because of their thinking and their deeds, have earned eternal relevance, which leaves something important for us to reflect on in today's world, inspiring a passion for peace. And our next speaker is Eamon Rafter. Eamon, he is a member of World Beyond War Ireland. Eamon is also a member of STOP, that is Swords to Ploughshares, and STOP is a network of peace groups throughout the whole island of Ireland. STOP has sponsored tonight's webinar with AFRI, INATE and Peace People as co-sponsors, who are all very concerned about Ireland's ever-deepening involvement in the war industry and its devastating impact on the planet. So our three speakers will reflect on the insatiable expansion of EU militarism and the urgent need to support and retain Ireland's neutrality. They will examine how the global war industry dictates massive increases in military budgets in order to gain obscene profits using the war in Ukraine. So the case for meaningful diplomatic negotiation will be examined, and support for Ireland's neutrality as the only sane way forward in conflict resolution in the world. To borrow a phrase, Ireland should be profiled as a centre of the peace industry and not just another outpost of the war. Militarism doesn't serve people. It robs the public purse. It creates catastrophic environmental destruction and shameful human sacrifice. So we promote peace and neutrality in order to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Otherwise, we're only deluding ourselves. So there will be time for questions using the chat facility, and it will be hosted by Ian Atack. So thanking you all for joining us this evening, and over to you, Niamh.
For that introduction. Thanks everybody for joining us. I think we're hoping to make this evening's discussion as interactive as possible. So I'll try and keep my interventions, and also the other panelists will be hopefully more conversational than they will formal presentations. And also, like Miriam said, do put your comments in the chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. I suppose European militarism is something that is not new, even though it's, we're maybe becoming more aware of it now in the context of the Ukraine war. But I think in Ireland, at least, we're very aware of, I suppose all of the movement around the Lisbon Treaty and how we would vote in the Lisbon Treaty back in 2008, 2009. And a lot of what we're seeing now in terms of the common security and defence policy in the European Union actually stems from what came after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty. At the Transnational Institute, we produced two reports recently. One of them looks at the question of how the first precursor European Union spending went in terms of funding weaponry. And maybe just to mention just a few of the findings of that report, because it was really a kind of a new point of departure for the European Union, that it would, with public money, fund the research and development of weaponry. And as I say, that stems back again to kind of the idea that we would have this common security and defence policy. And that money, when we researched it in Transnational Institute, we found that it's 600 million euros, the precursor programme. We found serious conflicts of interest. We found evidence of corruption. And corruption very much in the public domain. It's not that European Union was funding arms companies without knowing that they were corrupt, because we were able to find it with a quick Google search. the EU is funding arms companies that are producers of nuclear weapons, so indirectly funding nuclear armament. We also found that the European Union is funding research and development of autonomous weapons, semi-autonomous smart weapons, artificial intelligence weaponry, and there's a huge legal grey area there about how this weaponry will operate in international humanitarian law and how it will be rolled out in the context of an armed conflict. And then we found huge questions of transparency, oversight, ethics, you know, huge kind of question marks around what kind of controls, if any, were being put in place before this money, massive amounts of money were being handed over to arms companies. This is a very short kind of summary of how we've seen the European defence funding being spent so far. This is only a drop in the ocean. The funding from the European Union's budget for 2021-2027, when you combine all of the European Union budgets in terms of military, defence and security, we got to a figure of over 43 billion. This is just at European Union level, and this is going to be, of course, propped up by spending at national level from different member states across the European Union. And what we see is that the vast majority of these 43 billion is actually going to, again, private companies and arms companies mostly. Just to mention maybe two of the most controversial funds is the European Defence Fund, which, as I said, is funding weapons research and development, and yeah, very problematic in terms of the kind of weaponry that's being funded. And also the European Peace Facility, which is an off-book fund which is outside of European parliamentary scrutiny, and this fund is designed to provide weaponry in the situation of war. And we've seen that with the war in Ukraine, which is the first time when the European Union, the European Commission has decided to activate and implement this fund to fund directly sending weapons to Ukraine. Other than that, the funds are being spent on border militarization, surveillance, smart technologies, and also we see a complete diversion of development aid, which is being diverted under very kind of the argumentation for developing for diverting development aid into militarism and defense is really Orwellian in the way that it's structured in the European kind of documents that kind of underpin that the development funding and where it's going. So I suppose I suppose maybe just on that note of Orwellian times, war is peace. We've seen that there's actually zero kind of capacity to think outside the box when we are in a state of permanent war for many years now. There's many wars going on around the world, many armed conflicts, but I think that a lot there's a lot more attention, I think, at this point because of what's happening in Ukraine around the question of neutrality. And I know that in Ireland we've definitely had neutrality being discussed. And I suppose not just in Ireland, but also we've seen that in Finland and in Sweden, there's actually been concrete moves to shift that policy. So maybe that as the kind of first opening on the question of European militarism. Very quickly, I will put some links in the chat to those two reports that I mentioned. And now I'll ask if Jan can come in and tell us a little bit about, maybe because I imagine that the majority of our audience is an Irish-based audience. So maybe Jan, you can start us off very basically, first of all, telling us kind of what was the situation before the Ukraine war in terms of Sweden and Finland and the neutrality question, and what has happened since.
Thank you very much, and thank you for arranging this and having me as a participant in this important dialogue. I'd like to completely support what you said in the beginning here about the EU pattern and the militarism built into the Lisbon Treaty, and also I can't help it since I've worked a lot in former Yugoslavia and partly educated there. It's interesting that the only time when there were really a foreign policy decision spoken with one voice was when the EU got the mad idea of recognizing Slovenia and Croatia out of Yugoslavia, which de facto, I'll not go into why, but de facto, as we all said and predicted who knew about it, could not but make the war in Bosnia inevitable. There was no way you could save Bosnia when you had taken Slovenia and Croatia out of Yugoslavia and didn't have a clue about what to do with the rest. So the peace record, I must say, although the EU got the Nobel Peace Prize, which is not an honor these days, is quite miserable. That we see also now in Ukraine. The only thing the West can stand up and say we're really together in this is this totally destructive militarist response to the war, which should, of course, never have been, the invasion should never have taken place. But this was an absolutely, utterly self-destructive and world-destructive response to that invasion of Ukraine. When it comes to Sweden, as it's no doubt in my mind, I've lived here for more than 50 years, although I'm a Danish citizen. I followed this from way before the time of Olof Palme. And Olof Palme's Sweden was one of genuine neutrality, although we all knew that Sweden belonged more to the West than the East. It was of disarmament, it was nuclear disarmament. It was the phenomenally important concept of common security that was published in a report in the mid-80s. The idea that we cannot be secure unless somebody else is also secure, namely Russia. It was the Egon Bahr, it was the Germans, it was the Social Democrats in Europe who was driving these things together with CND, END, and the peace movement, and the priests, and women's movement, and all that. Now, Olof Palme was killed, and so was his policy. Very quickly after his physical death, Sweden began to reorient itself towards the United States in all kinds of ways, politically, industrially, etc. And also, you know, accepting things like the Iraq War, continuing exporting weapons to the US, although Sweden cannot officially export weapons to countries at war when the US invaded Iraq. And you can go on like that. There's been a host nation support agreement. There has been huge common exercises with NATO in northern Sweden. Politically, there has been no example the last 20 years where Sweden has been independently voicing a critical stance about anything the United States and NATO has done. And so, to make a long story short, the Ukraine invasion could be used immediately, panically, but that was exactly what everybody wanted. I'm surprised that President Putin has not obviously predicted for himself that he would deliver all the best arguments for NATO membership of Finland and Sweden on a silver plate to these countries and to NATO allies. And so what I was really upset about, and I think it's not worthy, it's not decent for a democracy, was there was basically no public discussion here about it. It was forced through very quickly with public relation marketing arguments of the lowest level, no political security, no future analysis or consequence analysis. In the case of Sweden, there were 48% in favor of membership, according to opinion polls. We didn't have a referendum, like no other NATO new member country recently has had. And so you can say this would be a totally administered decision to join, with the argument, two things, that if he can do that in Ukraine, he can do it anywhere, which is I mean, it's an illusory statement in terms of security politics. It's not the same to do these two things. And secondly, not to go into that at this point, there were very good reasons, because my formulation is Putin or Russia is responsible for the war in Ukraine, and NATO is responsible for the underlying conflict. And we cannot discuss violence without discussing underlying conflicts, and that's NATO's expansion. So we're just making things much worse by having Finland and Sweden joining as full members. And I regret this because I think that there is a potential for intelligent, independent choices in foreign policy if you are not allied. And these two countries have now played this out of their own hands. There's no way Sweden could, with a little rested head of independent mind, there's no way you can practice that in the future. You will be a pawn in the game, And the game is so far until the United States and the empire and militarism and warfare and all that falls apart and NATO falls apart, which I predict will happen more than maximum 5 years from now. You will be a pawn in the game. You will not have any way of making independent, serious decisions about nuclear weapons, about disarmament, about solving Ukraine in another way, etc. You can just as well close down the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and have a telephone answering machine to Washington, to put it a little bit too crudely, but you see what I mean. So this is very sad because we need neutral countries in Europe. There are roughly 20 neutral countries around the world that are doing fantastic work, precisely by not taking sides, but being active in potentially possible to be active in conflicts. Neutrality doesn't mean to be passive, it means to be active, such as in mediation, such in consulting, such as like Switzerland, inviting parties to sit and discuss things in your country. It is all these things that we are losing now in Finland and Sweden. I totally regret it. It's a stupid choice and it was an undemocratic choice.
Thank you, Jan, for setting the tone, I suppose, around how the concept of neutrality is under attack, really, and as you kind of laid out, I suppose the context with the war in Ukraine has been used in a way to instrumentalize this move towards moving into NATO, but it sounds like that was already in the pipeline for quite some time.
Oh yes.
Yes.
And you see,
and I think that
the intellectual level that it was argued the last 20 years in Sweden by NATO advocates, you cannot be neutral if there are not two pacts. I mean, neutrality is a way of running politics. It's not a standing, between parties and saying nothing. But the intellectual, I call it intellectual disarmament. That's what has gone on the last 20 years in the Western world. If you ask a politician today, what does peace mean? What does deterrence mean? What does security mean? You won't have a 30-second intelligent answer from anyone who runs the show.
It's a little bit like after the attacks in 9/11, the discourse from George Bush that you're either with us or against us. You cannot be neutral. And maybe on that note, I'll bring in Eamon, because Jan, you said there's very few neutral countries left in the world, and I suppose Ireland is one that is militarily neutral. And I suppose maybe Eamon, you can discuss a little bit about how the discussions have been going in Ireland recently with the question of neutrality, and also the question of one voice, I think, which Jan raised it in the context of the Balkans, but how likely is it that Ireland or the Irish government may be able to be that voice that's not actually following kind of the narrative that's coming out of Brussels, but actually challenging that with a neutral stance?
Thanks, Niamh and Jan, for your introductory inputs, and I would agree with pretty much everything that we've heard so far. Ireland's neutrality, we'd have to be honest and say, we might be smug and think, oh, it's grand, but if we look at it in a bit more seriously, we'd have to say that for many years it's been, if not fading, then certainly under severe threat. And nothing makes that more evident than the continued use, for example, of Shannon Airport, and the American military using Shannon as a jumping off point. So, I mean, we could ask a question there: how can a country say it's neutral if it makes its bases available, or it makes its airports available as bases? But then, I suppose nominally, I think, as far as I understand it, Japan defines itself as neutral, and yet has hosts a number of American bases. but that's another story. But in terms of Ireland's neutrality, I mean, can we honestly and seriously say we really are neutral? Of course, those of us probably on this call would insist that yes, we are, and I completely agree that there's never been a more important moment for that neutrality to be active, and to be actually a position where a country takes a stand and says, no, we have our own foreign policy, and we don't necessarily see the world as divided into these two blocks, or good and evil, depending on any given day, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And I mean, so for example, at the moment, what the kind of thing we're hearing mentioned in Ireland is, how could we be neutral in the face of an onslaught against a poor country like Ukraine? And, you know, again, it's this notion that what neutrality is about, in some people's eyes, is the evasion of responsibility. Whereas I think we take the absolute opposite view of neutrality, that it's an active position that allows a country to play a positive role in building peace. So where's Irish neutrality at then, if that's the case, if Shannon is on the go, if Ireland is fully immersed and more immersed in the European Defence Agency, European Defence Fund, is trying to get its hand in at some level into be a player on the stage of arms, the arms industry, although that's still quite a small role in Ireland. But we've seen our current government, you know, pushing the ante on that and offering incentives to both academia and small, medium enterprises to get involved and reap some of the benefits that are going. So can we say, therefore, that it is possible to be neutral in the current structures we have within Europe that Niamh referred to earlier? I mean, is neutrality a possibility? Well, I will continue to insist that it is a possibility, and not only is it a possibility, it's a necessity. Let's look very briefly at where Ireland kind of originally draws its rationale around neutrality. Our constitution says in Article 29, the Constitution of Ireland from 1939, says that Ireland affirms its devotion to the ideal of peace and friendly cooperation amongst nations founded on international justice and morality, and asserts that the peaceful resolution of conflicts is what a small country like Ireland can offer to the world. And at some level, Ireland has played a role in that, in terms of creating an identity that was mostly about soft power, a diplomatic influence that was probably much bigger in some ways than the size of the country, and the danger with the kind of whittling away or the erosion of that neutrality is Ireland loses that potential for that role, to be that influencer, mediator, however we want to describe it, and be one of join the club and be one of the big boys. And I use the word boys specifically because it is a bit of a boys club, isn't it, when we come to the armaments industry and so on. So it looks as though Ireland is looking for a share of the pie. And the encouraging thing that I have to offer on all of this is that the people of Ireland continue, when asked, to say very clearly, certainly in a reasonably strong majority, that yes, we stand for neutrality and we want to retain our neutrality. And the most recent articulation of that was an Irish Times poll, which we have pretty much, you know, more than 65, close to 70% of people saying that neutrality is part of how they see the country, and they want to continue that even in the face of the Ukraine war. So yeah, I reiterate, it's vital to us, it's very important to us, but it's not the stand. Neutrality is not a position of cowardice, it's a courageous act in the modern world. And we need to constantly remind ourselves that we need to take on that courageous role, despite the fact that our government might be trying to move in other directions. The people of Ireland need to be better informed about this, which is part of what STOP is trying to do. We had earlier, or late last year, we were involved in the Downpatrick Declaration, which basically juxtaposed the Irish Constitution and the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement, to remind you, says Ireland affirms its devotion to the ideal of peace and friendly we reaffirm our total and absolute commitment to exclusive, democratic and peaceful means of resolving differences. That's an international agreement between Britain and Ireland. Why are we not doing that? Why are we not playing that role? We can and we must.
Thanks for that, Eamon. Maybe just to mention, I suppose what we're up against in terms of advocating a neutral position. I mentioned earlier, I think that I read in The Guardian today an article which argues that it's wrong to be a pacifist. And it says, and I quote, "Playing the game of neutrality is a shortcut to catastrophe." And this is what is being published in newspaper like The Guardian, you know, which it's yeah, I think that to understand kind of all of the actors at play here, because, you know, I think to my mind and to I think to the people on this call, neutrality, as we've said, is a very active stance. It is principled. It has a direction. It has a, you know, it's not standing by. It's actively pushing for something. In this case, peace. And I think, yeah, it seems to be eroded. And I suppose maybe it would be interesting to discuss a little bit the power structures that we're up against, because I think now and I'm sure many of us on this call who have spoken you know, against kind of the armament in Ukraine and in favor of peace have been put into the pro-Russia, pro-Putin, even when we circulated a tweet, you know, and publicity on this webinar, there was a tweet which called us terrorist appeasers. And so, you know, you call for peace and this is kind of the response that you get. So I suppose, yeah, maybe I'll throw the question to Jan and then over to Eamon as well to maybe understand a little bit more the power structures that we're up against. I'm thinking a bit about the arms companies, but I'm wondering kind of what you understand to be the power structures that we're up against.
You'd like me to start?
Yeah, why not?
Well, I think it's what over the years I've developed the concept by inspiration from Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell speech. He talked about the military-industrial complex. I insist on talking about the military-industrial media academic complex, MIMAC. Because wherever you go, big and small, all countries except those who don't have an army and who are not involved in such as Iceland, you find the MIMACs everywhere. And these are the structures which are not or only partly under democratic control, as Eisenhower also said in his speech. And they are able to do what is overlooked by most people. Most people think that a threat is something that is developed seriously by analytical people, you know, military threats, non-military threats, what is challenges for our country in the next few years, etc. And then you shape a defense after that, according to how much resources you have for it. Now, that's not the way it goes. You can go back to the early 70s when the German researcher Dieter Senghaus wrote about the military-industrial complex. He said it works the other way. You have a system that needs constantly to produce, develop, and sell weapons and military structures and military worldviews, etc. And in order to make taxpayers pay for that, you have to construct enemies. What would the West do if it didn't have enemies? I mean, some of the most fundamental sentences that have been said about the time after the Cold War was, I think it was Arbatov, Gorbachev's leading, or one of his many advisors, who said to us in the West, we are going to do here in Russia a terrible thing to you in the West. We're going to deprive you of your enemy. And ever since, the West has been unable to live without enemies. This has to do with Christianity. This has to do with a missionary idea that they must become like us, or it's either us or you or them or whatever. Quote George W. Bush after 9/11. And it has to do with this stupid idea that one culture's values can be universalized. That also means that the idea of solving conflicts with violent means can be globalized, which is why the US has 630 bases in, 130 countries or something like that. Long story short, we're at a completely irrational, psychotic level of politics, which you can no longer analyze by rational means and concepts. Namely, when somebody decides that a military alliance must have 2% of its gross national product set off for military affairs in a world where we need resources to all kinds of other things, you have lost rational thinking about what really threatens us. Because it's a bizarre idea that if a country's economy goes up a little bit, you should spend more on the military. And if it goes down a little bit, you should spend less on the military. A military or defense system, civil and military, should be geared to what the threat or the challenge is the next 20, 40 years is, and not to the size of the gross national product. I have seen nobody in the media, I've seen no politicians in NATO ever challenging that utterly stupid and nonsensical concept. And those kinds of things are now running its own show. Let me give you this, as I called it, military intellectual disarmament. The Swedish Prime Minister goes out saying, after the Parliament has decided to submit a membership application to NATO, quote, "There are many things in Sweden that we can disagree about, but we cannot disagree about the fact that we love Sweden. Sweden, therefore, should be defended, and that defense must take place in the future in NATO." Quotation over. Now, this is totally abdication of any intellectual forecasting or models or ideas about the future. It is public relations speech. And that's why I insist, if we're going to have peace, we got to have knowledge. We've got to have politicians who can read and write books. We have to have somebody who can check in the media the nonsense and the utter BS that is uttered by people who sit on nuclear weapons these days. We live in a very dangerous world, not because of the weapons only, because they've always been around. We sit in a very difficult and dangerous situation because of the intellectual moral disarmament everywhere, particularly in the West. Look at the Cold War against China. You know, Ukraine is just a pretext for all this. The idea is to get rid of Russia as a challenge, and then we can gather all up and gang up against China. I mean, we're going to destroy ourselves doing this. This is obvious to me. But these forces are not under democratic check and balances anymore. They're running this show, and they do it through the media and most of research. State institutes who cannot challenge the paradigms of their own state security politics. I'm very happy I'm a totally free researcher, and that's probably why I sound a little bit different from those who sit elsewhere.
Thank you for that, Jan. Gosh, there's an awful lot in that, but I have to, I agree with all of what you've said. I think just looking at the time, maybe just going to move on to Eamon and raise something around, I suppose, the concept of what makes us feel safe, and it's linked a little bit also to what Jan kind of said, that Sweden must be defended, and to defend it we need NATO. And I suppose just thinking about over the last 2 years, we've just come through a global pandemic, and if there was ever a time when it was clearer that to defend or to care or to make ourselves feel safe, I think that vast majority of people would agree that it's, you know, a functioning health service, access to medical care, to medical attention, health, education, all of the, social services. You would think that it has never been clearer that that is what we need to make us feel safe, and yet we have, countries like Germany dropping 100 billion under the pretext of Ukraine, and many other, which was already in the pipeline actually since last October, but that got shelved also with the media. But yeah, I suppose how can we how can we trigger kind of in people's minds, I suppose, as in the context of making a case for peace, that if we need peace, it has to be a positive peace, and that, yeah, how can we remind people that only very recently we were locked up in our homes with COVID, and you know, what we need to feel safe is actually nothing to do with guns and bombs and tanks, but actually to do with, you know, access to healthcare.
Yeah, I agree. We're strange creatures, aren't we? In many ways, the constructs that we, you know, create and the threats we kind of build to justify all this, you know, ridiculous spending on weapons, etc. But for me, it's about you know, a real need to start rethinking and talking about security and what it really means, because I think there's been a huge distortion. I mean, obviously it's easy to blame the media for everything, but I do think media have played a huge role in this, in ramping up discourses around hatred and threat and fear. We have it in relation to refugees, you know, and the shift in the European Union policy to one which is pretty much a militaristic one, and financial support for Frontex, because of the fear that we're going to be invaded by unfortunate millions of people who are fleeing war and climate change. So, I mean, I think we need to sponsor a discussion around security. And security, as Jan said early on, is about, it's a common or human notion. It's about, I'm going to be safer if you're safer. And in a small country like Ireland, where you know, we too are talking about going up to 2% of GDP on weapons, and yet we're really struggling to provide housing for people, to provide even decent, relatively decent healthcare to people. It is ridiculous that these things are not defined in terms of things that make us much more secure, and that's the kind of security we need. I would have thought, and we would have all thought, that the pandemic would have brought that home to us a little more, that our security is brittle, but that the threats that we are told about are not the real threats to human security. We haven't even mentioned the whole area of climate change, but that's going to be one of the huge areas that we need to focus on in terms of how we're going to make ourselves safer and more secure. So the thing about the knowledge, I mean, it's remarkable that the figure that's thrown out is that 12% of Europeans have any understanding of what PESCO is, what the common security policy is, what the European Defence Fund. So effectively, people don't know because they're not informed about these things. One of the media responsibilities is to provide information for citizenry to be able to make more informed decisions and to be able to participate in democracy. They're not doing that in the Irish situation, I would argue strongly, and probably not in many other places. So a Guardian article that you refer to, Niamh, that says, yeah, pacifism is, you know, is weak and, you know, immoral or whatever, is kind of very much part of that whole message. You know, the creation of the binary world and the argument that if we're for peace, we're therefore on the side of Putin. All these things need to be called out because, you know, there's a touch of the emperor's new clothes about this. Even if we dare not say that the emperor is naked, I think we should start saying the emperor is not dressed in anything like as well as he or she thinks they are. We need to challenge these things, and we need to demand a dialogue around where we're going in terms of our security. And that should be a very key part of building deeper and stronger democracies, creating the mechanisms, the systems in societies that help to make us safer in a real sense, and get away from these constructed threats, which are really only about making a lot of money for arms companies and some other people as well.
Thanks for that, Eamon. Maybe just on the question of informing people and that they have access to knowledge. There was a research institute in the US that asked people if they were in support of a no-fly zone, and the vast majority said yes. And then when they were actually told what that actually implies, they very quickly shifted and said, actually, no, I don't support a no-fly zone. So I think even just making information available, having knowledge, having places where you can engage, have dialogue. And I think that's also what tonight's event is about. And on that note, I'm going to move to our questions so that it's not just the three of us talking, but we can also bring in the audience. So so we've just under 15 minutes or under 20 minutes. And the first question is that I see on my screen here is about the question of nuclear weapons. Why are we driving, I suppose, this kind of nuclear, why are we ramping up the kind of the tension around nuclear weapons, nuclear armament and that? So I've 5 questions in front of me, so we'll keep our answers short. And I'm not sure if Jan or Eamon, who would like to take the question on why this drive and this kind of competition around nuclear weapons.
Well, I guess it's simply because they are special weapons, and with the kind of, I wouldn't say racist attitude, but there are those who have nuclear weapons have always thought that those who didn't have them should not have them because they are the lower level of civilization. I mean, look at the American attitude to Iran in terms of culture and history. And because it gives these countries a special role. They can all feel exceptional, whether China or France or Britain or whatever. I have always been of the opinion that nobody should have these weapons. And if they should have them, it should be because their own people are willing to have them on their own territory. They are fundamentally offensive weapons. They are unlimited destructive, and they can reach the consequences very far away. And therefore, there is not a single nuclear weapon in the world that is for defense. And there's not a single kind of deterrence or what we call balance of terror. But the word terror is now reserved for small groups like al-Nusra. But the biggest terrorists in this world are those who have nuclear weapons. Terrorism being defined as using civilians and innocent people in your political struggle to achieve a political goal. There's nobody bigger terrorist in the world than those who have and insist on keep on having nuclear weapons. So that's why I also think it's very sad that neutrality is under attack, because the neutral countries would never dream about getting it, but they would work for getting rid of them.
Yeah, just maybe to add to that, of course, you know, we now have the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but you know, of course, countries that have nuclear weapons are not going to be signing that. Isn't it very unsurprising that the Security Council permanent members are all nuclear powers, whose interests are not served by a treaty like it? But on the other hand, one thing that I do feel a little proud of is that the Ireland has been was one of the drivers of that treaty, and yet they are quite happy to sit in discussions with NATO, which is, let's face it, an armed nuclear alliance. So again, contradictions abound, don't they?
Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, the EU is indirectly funding companies that produce nuclear weaponry. Now I have another question, and it is about the role that non-violent civilian defense can play in kind of opposing European militarism. So we haven't really said so much about non-violent civil defense. But yeah, I'll throw out that as a kind of an alternative or way of pushing back, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's very important, but as I said, there's very few doing research on it today. It's not part of the political discourse, like peace is no longer part of the discourse. There is nobody asking questions anymore in the Western mainstream media. Mr. Prime Minister or Mrs. Prime Minister, do you think this adds to peace or make peace more likely? There's very little peace research left anywhere in the world where the goal is to reduce violence, structural violence, direct violence, cultural violence, gender violence. And there is very little left in politics. Somebody who rises and say we should introduce, as a part maybe of a new defensive common security, human security structure in Europe, one element should be nonviolence, would be met with, oh, that's not realistic. Whereas the more weapons we have and the more we bring the world to the brink of Armageddon, that is called realism. And that's why I have the perhaps perverse view, it has got to become much worse in the world, particularly the Western world, before we see change. And that means, in my view, a further decline and a fall of the US empire. And when that happens, a fall of NATO. And when that slate is clean, we're back to where we were, should have been 30 years ago, and we can create a new and better world. There's no way, in my view, we can introduce all these things. How we should keep on arguing for it and writing about it, that's not my point. But we cannot expect it to happen before that evil force called militarism embedded in the US NATO structure will go. That's when we can have a multipolar world. And that's when we can begin to think of cooperation instead of confrontation in the world. And that's, if you will, that's what the Chinese are doing. They're doing nonviolence in a new way. They are doing the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Roads, which is a way of shaping a new world without violence. And if you ask me as a peace researcher, the more we glue each other together in mutually win-win structures, the less the risk of warfare and fighting each other, because we always fight those we don't know or those we've learned to hate. But it's not in the genes of people to hate and fight all the time. So I'm looking for a world in which we can cooperate and in which nonviolence will come back as a totally normal and intelligent way of dealing with conflicts.
Maybe following that question, and it's maybe, Eamon, I'll get you to come in on this one. It's, yeah, linked, I suppose, to the question of nonviolence, but then how can we encourage diplomacy? So there's a question about how we can, how we can find room to encourage diplomacy up against all of what we've just spoken about, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose this comes back to the whole notion that, you know, that ultimately conflicts are only ever going to be resolved through some form of negotiated, process. Even if war goes on for a long time, you know, eventually we'll come to a point where diplomacy has to be involved at a higher level. But at a more important way, it's the preventative side of it, because diplomacy is about relationships. It's about people's engagement. It's the engagement of perhaps nations with each other, of people with each other, but also of exploring human resources in a very, very different way. And instead of thinking, what's the potential for gain in making money here? Why is the consideration not given to the fact that here's something that might actually support both the prevention of conflict, which is, you know, it took a long time before Russian troops actually, you know, invaded the full country of Ukraine, although they were around for 5 years and very little was done. So the potential moment for diplomacy was wasted. The possibilities around the two Minsk agreements just weren't worked on. You know, there was potential there, but people had to engage, and again, nothing happened until it was too late, if you like. So negotiations and diplomacy have to happen at a time when there's potential to build relationships, to build trust. When that trust is broken and it's gone, it's very hard for a diplomatic solution to suddenly kick in and have some results. We need to look back to the world order in terms of how the UN is constructed, how it's financed. We need to look at the potential of, for example, OSCE, which I think is something that's not thought about enough or not mentioned enough, and look at the resources that are available to bring to these areas. Of course, that it won't be what arms companies are getting excited about, of course, because it might put them a little bit out of business. But I think that's where we should be concentrating resources and efforts, and human resources as well. We need to learn how to do this, because as Jan has said, have we forgotten that, you know, non-violence has actually been something that's been developed and used over hundreds and thousands even of years? So let's get back and start talking and working with them.
Thanks, Eamon. I have a few questions that are specific to Ireland, so maybe, Eamon, I'll ask you to help me out with some of them. We've just under 10 minutes left. But so one of the questions is there a strategy to dialogue with different Irish political parties to articulate a neutrality platform? So are there, if you are aware of any efforts, either maybe people on this call or other peace groups that may be trying to already influence the... I
mean, I am aware of, you know, so for example, the Irish anti-war movement at a recent meeting called for, you know, a relaunch of you know, an Irish neutrality alliance, and bearing in mind that that was originally something that James Connolly thought up in 1914. You know, at the onset of the First World War, a group of, you know, trade unionists, political representatives, people coming together to say, okay, we're going to work together on this process. So again, that was articulated, but if you look at where it's coming from some of the smaller political parties, more associated with the Irish left. Do they have the numbers? Do they have the power to actually build a bigger engagement with the more, you know, the ruling parties? I don't know, but I think there's an interest in actually trying to push and promote that. And of course, a big question there is where does our Green Party sit in the midst of all this? Because we were under the impression that you know, that peace and neutrality were at least once upon a time part of the agenda of the Green Party. So these parties certainly have an interest in building alliances around neutrality. How can we promote a dialogue? We're being told that there's a possibility of a citizens' assembly around this, but I think we'd want to be careful around this, because this could be something that is set up by government in order to kind of, let's say, manipulate the conversation in certain directions. I'm a little cautious, and I think people in STOP are a little bit cautious. But certainly a national conversation would be something that I think would be very, very important for Ireland to bring neutrality back onto the agenda. Let's start thinking and learning about it, and let's start talking about it. I think we need to do that.
Okay, thanks, Eamon. We've just under 5 minutes left, and I've one question which I think maybe yeah, it's a general question, so maybe I'll throw it out to both of you and see how we get on with time. We'll try and end on time. Yeah, I suppose it's about the role of cities and mayors, and I suppose how can we respond to what we've been speaking about for the last hour or so is very much kind of from the top down, kind of government level on a, you know, national level. And I suppose this question is thinking more in terms of maybe bottom up organizing at city level, municipality level. So as an alternative, I don't know if Jan, maybe you have any examples in that regard, and maybe Eamon as well, if you want to come in. We've got 4 minutes, so.
No, I don't need that long time. Just if you look at how we got rid of the first Cold War, it had very much to do with citizens' movements, marches, meetings, study circles, congresses, campaigns. It had to do with something where people did things, but did not just press like on Facebook. You see all this discussion about discussing things, and we must have a dialogue. And one difference is people in power are not interested in dialogue with the citizens. They just run over and do what they want. Most leaders today in the Western world are more loyal with other leaders than they are with their own citizens. And I believe in some kind of, you know, non-violent action revolution. We've got to get out in the streets. We've got to do things that the media cannot not report on because it's visible. And we need to write better books and do white books and alternative research, because the only thing that is obvious to me after 45 years in this business is that there are only alternatives to the present policies. with nuclear weapons, militarism, interventionism, confrontation, hardline ideas and all that. And that's the final thing I want to say, and it's been very much on my mind, and I can't help saying it exactly when I'm talking with you guys. It is to quote George Bernard Shaw. I suppose he's rather well known over there. And if I'm not completely wrong, he said something like, most people look at the world as it is and ask why. What we should do is to look at the world as it could be and ask why not. And it is this constructive, when you've analyzed the world well, factually, etc., and when you have done a critical aspect of it, then do like the doctor and say, what do we do about it? It's not enough to have just a dialogue about security or something lofty. It's important to say, here's an alternative defense plan for my country or for Europe, and drag people into a discussion about how it could look better, because anything that from what we compared with what we have to do would be better. Anybody who've been thinking of these things could come up with an alternative security architecture for Europe in half an hour.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Eamon, I'll give you the last word, and then I'll hand over to Miriam to close us out.
I think we're accustomed to sort of use phrases like that. We need to speak truth to power, but you know, when I hear that phrase, I think, yeah, but power may not want to know, or power is not listening. You know, so I think we have to be honest with ourselves that there's a struggle involved here, and that there will be no concessions unless this struggle it is built to a greater capacity, which means a wider engagement of the citizenry in all the countries we mentioned.
Oh, Eamon, I think you're frozen. Is it just for me? Jan, can you see Eamon, or?
No, I can't see Eamon.
I think he seems
frozen.
to have
I think he's frozen.
I think maybe he's being very strict with his time. Eamon, we lost you for a second.
Sorry, just to say, this is a long-term commitment, and we need to be aware of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
If
Eamon.
we have enough time.
Indeed.
Yeah. We're running out.
Well, I don't know
Not
whether
only here, but in the world.
In the world, yeah.
I don't know whether to take the positive away from it and thinking along the lines of the Bernard Shaw quote, or to take what Jan said, that things have to get much worse before they get better. But I suppose it's a dose of hope and realism. And maybe I think I'll hand us over to Miriam to close us out. But it was a fascinating discussion. I think we could probably continue for another half an hour if we could. But Miriam, are you there to close us out?
Yes, unfortunately,
okay.
I can't turn on my video. It says
don't worry,
the host has to turn it on my behalf. So just to say thank you all so much for joining us, and particularly our three speakers, and thanks to Angela for all the technical work behind the event. So do stay in touch with us on Facebook and Instagram, and on our new channel on YouTube. So, Iwa, Gurmila Mahakut.